Há mais de 10 anos, eu pesquiso aprendizagem transformadora, reflexão crítica e desenvolvimento de competências. Eu faço parte de uma rede internacional de aprendizagem transformadora, né, que são instituições que estão pensando, né, em como promover melhores experiências de aprendizagem para os seus alunos. Isso para dizer para vocês que os convidados, né, internacionais dessa semana fazem parte desta rede ao qual eu pertenço. Eu estive ano passado, em junho, comecinho de julho, na Teachers College, na Columbia University, fechando um acordo de cooperação com a professora Vitória Marsic, que vocês vão ouvir daqui a pouco. E ela supervisionou também o trabalho de uma orientanda minha, né, que esteve lá uns 2 anos atrás. E a gente segue trabalhando juntas e produzindo artigos e pesquisas na área do Transformative Learning e Transformative Listening. Amanhã vão estar conosco Jeff King, que foi o meu supervisor de pós-doutorado no Centro de Excelência em Ensino-Aprendizado Transformador de Oklahoma. Isto é, vocês vão estar ouvindo pessoas muito próximas, né, ao círculo de pesquisa que eu venho conduzindo todos esses anos. Mas vocês devem estar se perguntando, né? Por que que a gente precisa falar em aprendizagem transformadora e por que que ela deve ser uma ideia, né, que atravessa toda a universidade, né? A aprendizagem transformadora se refere a um profundo processo de contínuo questionamento e reflexão sobre a nossa razão de ser enquanto universidade. Né? Continuamente ela faz nos perguntar por que fazemos o que estamos fazendo semestre a semestre. Ela coloca questões como, por exemplo, estamos apenas reproduzindo hábitos e ideias que já não são mais pertinentes ao ensino superior? Estamos ajudando, de fato, os nossos alunos a serem bem-sucedidos na sua trajetória de aprendizagem nos anos que eles ficam conosco? É esse o conteúdo, de fato, que a gente deveria, né, estar trabalhando? São com essas dinâmicas que a gente deveria conduzir, né, os nossos cursos? E mais do que responder a essas questões, o mais importante é criarmos o hábito do questionamento contínuo. E esse é um exercício que todo educador deve fazer, né? Uma proposta pedagógica, né, da universidade que caminha nessa direção, ela é formada por uma variedade de espaços reflexivos e de ação, tanto dos docentes quanto dos discentes. O Fórum de Aprendizagem Transformadora é só um desses espaços, entre múltiplos outros que devem existir numa instituição que se desafia a pensar, a se rever, a conversar, conversas nem sempre fáceis, a escutar de verdade o outro, seja esse o aluno, o professor, as lideranças, né, o administrativo, a comunidade. E embora, no convite do fórum, né, solicitava uma leitura da Patrícia Cranton, né, que foi uma pesquisadora da Universidade de Toronto, e nós vamos ouvir várias experiências, né, ao redor do mundo de universidades que trabalham com Transformative Learning, é importante ficar claro que nós não estamos importando um modelo. Ao contrário, nós estamos ingressando numa rede internacional de universidades que trabalham em prol da aprendizagem transformadora. E vamos ter a oportunidade de co-criar aqui na nossa universidade, coletivamente, o que significa aprendizagem transformadora para nós, no contexto da nossa identidade institucional. Então, depois desses 2 dias de palestra, nós teremos 3 dias de rodadas de discussão para definir os eixos norteadores da nossa política educacional orientada à aprendizagem transformadora. E as competências que temos que desenvolver, né, nos nossos alunos daqui para frente. Especialmente aquelas competências voltadas a soft skills, que vão além das habilidades, né, core dos componentes curriculares. É um convite, claro, mas é muito importante que todos vocês se envolvam, nos ajudem a repensar o que é a universidade, o que ela deve ser daqui para frente, né? O que a gente acredita para os próximos anos. Então, sem mais demoras, após essa abertura, eu vou passar a palavra para a professora Vitória Marsic, que já está aqui conosco. Nós, infelizmente, não teremos muito tempo para o debate, porque não dá para fazer um debate, são muitas pessoas, né, participando da atividade, mas eu vou pedir para vocês, tem aí um botãozinho, Q&A, onde vocês podem ir colocando suas questões e perguntas. A minha equipe vai estar acompanhando, lendo todas essas questões, e aquelas mais recorrentes, nós vamos fazê-la ao final para a professora Vitória. E não se frustrem se nem todas as perguntas puderem ser respondidas agora, né? Quer dizer, nós vamos continuar tendo inúmeras conversas sobre aprendizagem transformadora, né? E tudo isso vai ser pensado em conjunto. Então, dando boas-vindas, nossa querida Vitória Marsic, que é diretora acadêmica do Centro de Aprendizagem de Adultos e Liderança do Departamento de Leadership and Organizations na Teachers College, Columbia University. Ela tem inúmeras publicações internacionais relevantes, seu doutorado é em Educação de Adultos pela Universidade de Califórnia, em Berkeley. Ela trabalhou extensivamente na Ásia e em outros países, com organizações sem fins lucrativos, e dirigiu o desenvolvimento e treinamento de funcionários na Unicef antes de ingressar no corpo docente da Teachers College. Vitória, querida, mais uma vez, obrigada por estar conosco, falando sobre o que é a aprendizagem transformadora, por que ela é tão importante no ensino superior e como ela vem sendo construída na Teachers College.
Thank you very much. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. Let's see if it works. You have it? Can you see it? Yes?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Let me make sure that it's on the right piece. Okay, we have it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you. And I have, as Professor Jeanette said, we've become colleagues and friends over the years as we work together in this area of transformative learning. So it's a pleasure to be here with you. What I'm going to be talking about today is, first just prefacing it, why is it so important for us to be concerned with transformative learning today? Secondly, and maybe most importantly, what is transformative learning? There are many ways of interpreting it. How transformative learning really can be facilitated in higher education. And I'm going to share some examples as I work through this, and in particular, give you some examples of how we are using it at Teachers College. So first, why is it important? Well, I think the question in part is what motivates transformation? Some people come to transformative learning very naturally, and in part their discipline motivates them, because there are disciplines that work with deep reflection and with narrative inquiry and things of that sort that find transformative learning. But all that aside, we are all asked to transform these days. The very, very uncertain environment, we call it VUCA for short, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, is constantly changing. And the pandemic of COVID-19 has just simply made very clear a lot of the structural problems in our societies and in the way in which we do things. And so we're called upon to transform. It's a transformative moment, a collective transformative moment. We are all experiencing a very disorienting dilemma. So what is our response? And it is motivated and prompted by the many environmental changes that we're undergoing. In demographics, the nature of young people today, old people today, people living longer. I know at your university, climate change is a big topic. Migration and immigration call for thinking differently about various aspects of how we run our societies. And in our country in particular, there has been a resurgence of awareness around social justice, social injustice, powered by the police brutality and the killings that have unfortunately happened, that have motivated a good deal of conversation about gender, race, and class and what we can do about it. And finally, as many of you are engaged in, we are preparing our students no matter what their age or where they are in their journey, for a shift to a very different kind of innovation and knowledge economy than we ran in the past. And as we move into we're in the middle of it, of course, we're not moving into it. This calls for rethinking a lot of things, because people organize their work and their learning very differently these days in order to really stay on top of things. So there are different approaches to transformative learning theory. We are going to be talking about the work of Jack Mesereau, because in part he popularized a lot of ideas around transformative learning, and we'll talk about what was key to the way he thought about it. But it is a very essentially a cognitive or rational approach that focuses in particular on thinking and how we think as adults and how we rethink as adults. It is connected to, but somewhat different from, developmental education. Some of you may know the work of Bob Keegan or Taylor and Maranow or Bill Torbert, certainly Piaget, who looked at adult development, children's development and adult development, and that involves a transformation of consciousness. But there are also more imaginal and affective approaches to transformative learning, some of which we use at Teachers College. And of course, Brazil is the proud home for Paulo Freire, who really is in some ways the grandfather of a lot of transformative approaches, and in fact was a great inspiration to Jack Mesereau when he was developing his theory. Jack Mesereau, who sometimes is considered a father, I'm waiting for some mothers here of transformative learning, because he really influenced the way in which we theorize about how transformative learning happens. And he really sought to explain the unique ways that adults learn. We all know that children acquire different kinds of ways of understanding the world they live in, and they learn to make meaning of the world as they grow up. Adults do continue to make meaning, but they already have acquired a lot of experience, and that involves the ways in which they interpret things in the world. That can be a plus and a minus, and transformative learning really asks the question of when and how are the ways in which we make meaning serving us well in the circumstances that we're in. The question I think that some of these opening presentations has raised, since we're in a very different time now, and we are examining a lot of questions about how our society is and how it should be. So what is transformative learning? It is, by Jack's definition, the process by which we transform our taken for granted frames of reference. And these are at the heart of perspectives that we strongly hold and we use to evaluate the meaning of any situation. And we know from neuroscience that people are natural meaning makers. We're always searching for understanding the meaning of a situation, and we will ascribe a meaning to it, whether it is a good thing or not, or whether it's accurate or not, because we need that connection in order to be able to put our thinking together. So some of the assumptions or the underlying ways we make sense of things are accurate and continue to track with the world as it is and with the situations that we encounter. But we also can have erroneous interpretations. Our knowledge might no longer serve us well. Our assumptions may no longer fit the circumstances at hand. And transformative learning calls for critically examining these prior interpretations of our situations in order to revise and create new meaning of our experience in the purpose of guiding our future action, recognizing that the way we make meaning really influences the actions that we take. At the heart of transformative learning, one of the processes or tools that it uses is critical reflection. And that's why we look at it as such a cognitive, this interpretation is so cognitively oriented. People sometimes wonder what is critical reflection. And so we contrast it with simple reflection. So I'm sure that many of you watch sports on television. And on television, when there's been an incredible play, whether it's a good play or a bad play, we have become accustomed to quick reviews of winding back the tape and walking through the play step by step. so that we understand what was done, how it was done, and whether something could have been done differently. That is really very important and not to be at all denigrated. It's a very important capability, but it isn't necessarily critical in the sense that Jack used the term. And he drew his meaning from John Dewey, who, as many of you may know, at Teachers College, he is a person who's greatly influenced almost all of us who teach, no matter what our domain at Teachers College. Dewey called this kind of reflection active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in light of the grounds that support it and the further conclusions to which it tends. So this is the basis for Jack's thinking around critical reflection. So I'm just wanting to share with you how he came up with this process briefly, and then to walk us through what he developed and theorized as a perspective transformation process. His thinking came up in studying reentry programs for women in colleges. And many of you may know reentry programs are special efforts to design conditions and classes and cluster support mechanisms for people who have been not used to being in the college environment. So in this case, it was women who had raised families and were at home, and after they raised their families, they were living longer lives, and they wanted to get involved in other kinds of things. They wanted to take on jobs and new roles, but they couldn't do that without going back to college and finishing their education and learning new things. And so colleges would set up these re-entry programs. And his wife Edie, she herself went through one of these programs, and he could see how much it changed her and the challenges that she went through as she confronted herself as someone who she felt was not quite up to what she needed to do in an educational situation, and how she overcame that with the help of very sympathetic and helpful instructors and faculty members. And so he wanted to understand this process. And in fact, I mentioned Paulo Freire. He had looked to Paulo Freire when he was thinking about some of the roots of this process, because he himself had a transformative learning experience when he was in Pakistan working with the government around community development. Paulo Freire's work had come out, and Jack, when reading it, realized that he himself was basing a lot of his assistance to Pakistan on erroneous assumptions, because he was basing it on how community development had originated in the United States, which was the work that he had always done. And he had to reframe and rethink the assumptions about what community development was. And he could see that in many ways, at least for his wife, that she had to rethink not only what she could do in the academic environment, but also who she was in the academic environment. Because this was a program, it started with a triggering event, something that was unexpected, disorienting. Just being in an academic environment, if you've been out for a long time, can do this to people. In addition to that, there were all the changes in the role of women. This was around the time that Betty Friedan had written The Feminine Mystique, and there were a lot of questions being asked about women's roles in society. And so this was the starting point for the process. I'm going to walk through it, but I'm going to use a more contemporary example because I know many of you, like me, have had to shift my classes and my teaching to an online environment. And this can be a perspective transformation, or can involve a perspective transformation, because although I wasn't against teaching online, I didn't do very much of it before this experience happened. And so the need to shift and do so quickly, and now as we move into the coming year online, to really redesign my courses so that they take advantage of what we know about good online teaching and learning, has caused a great deal of inner discomfort for me. And just as in perspective transformation, although we don't say necessarily, well, let me assess the situation, our first steps involve this trying to understand what's going on and whether or not we can accommodate and take in this new approach and not really reject who we think we are of ourselves as educators. And so looking at myself, what my pedagogy is, what's important to me, asking questions about, well, does it have to be only something that works on face-to-face, or can I take this into the online environment? Can I continue to do what I think is important in teaching and learning? talking with other people who are going through this process and getting their point of view, their stories, their examples, and therefore opening up my mind to other ways of thinking and doing things. In that process, we begin to transform what Jack called our frames of reference, or the meaning containers within which we create our perspectives. And this involved many different kinds of things. And as I began to change these perspectives in perspective transformation, you begin to try to internalize these and integrate them into your daily life. And so you need to explore options. What do I need to know? How can I plan to do my course conversions? I have to try on new roles as an educator, new things that I need to do with the online environment that I couldn't do in my classroom, and things in my traditional classroom that I can't really do online. And as you gain confidence and as you adopt your new perspective, and this is something that happens over time, you find that you're acting and working from within new perspectives, and you're integrating the new behavior into how we live and work. So this is the transformative learning process. There are many questions about it, and whether it has to be so unexpected and disorienting, or whether it could be a slower process. I'm happy to talk to you about that if you would like to go in that direction. But I want to say a few words about another very essential thing that came out in the women's reentry study, which isn't necessarily highlighted in quite the same way as I feel it should be in terms of why those programs were so successful. And I speak of this because I helped to do a lot of the research in the California higher education environments. And as a doctoral student at that time, I was learning to do grounded theory. And so I did a lot of observations and collecting of data. And I watched what was important in the program, and I talked to people who were running these programs, and I found that a holding environment for the women was really, really important. It wasn't only what went on in the classrooms in terms of teaching the content, but it was the relationships with the faculty and a whole kind of ecosystem that was built up to support these women. And so there was a lot of social support that emerged as really important in this study. And it very much is what very akin to what a number of people, for example, my colleague Aliki Nicolaitis talks about, that in these environments, we need to really focus not only on the content of what we're teaching, but on relational learning, because people really learn these things in and through and with one another. And so relationships and the relationships that we build become important to the learning process. There's also an element in that holding environment of just the right mix of challenge and support. And that's not something that is easily prescribed. It's something that you kind of have to feel your way into. And it does have to take into consideration the particular characteristics and needs of particular learners. This idea of holding environment reminded me of work I learned about a few years ago when I visited Brazil. I was there for a bit, and we went to a progressive school for young people that had sayings of Antonio Carlos Gomes da Costa on the walls. And I learned about his thinking, and I began to think about, in some ways, some of this is very much akin to some of what goes on in transformative learning. And particularly this idea of the pedagogy of presence, because of the relationship that that the educator works on and develops with each learner, and which is really very central to the right kind of challenge and support, and to social support. And so I felt that I wanted to point this out, because I think you have the roots of this in the thinkers in Brazil, in many of the thinkers in Brazil. And this is one of the examples, I think, that is a good fit with some of what we talk about in transformative learning. So the shift here to try to think about how to implement it in higher education. We know that there are many schools and professions are calling for reform in how we teach and learn. It's both in terms of the outcomes that people need to gain through transformative learning, as well as the processes that we use to get there. There have been such drastic and big changes in the way people think, what they have access to, what their habits are, so what our learners are like. what our knowledge base is in each of the professions and disciplines that we teach from, and really what the environment is asking us to do, whether we like it or not. The changes in the environment, external, the changes in the way delivery of healthcare is done, the call for changes in how we educate people, as Dr. Jeanette mentioned in her introduction, that we really have to ask ourselves whether or not our educational systems are the right ones. A few examples here come from the health field that has called for reevaluating how doctors are educated. We've been working with some people at Thomas Jefferson University, and one of our students there, an MD, has created an ambiguity curriculum, which they're using to prepare medical doctors in their their preparations scheme. And in fact, he is creating what he calls an action learning lab, which is something that we use to help to support transformative learning at Teachers College, that works on learning in the moment, and therefore helps people deal with the ambiguity that we face when we're in difficult situations where we don't have the right answer. It's happening in law schools, and of course, many of you know in business schools with climate change, with the move to self-managing organizations, globalization, entrepreneurship. These are important things. And so I wanted to bring to you an example of that might help us to take those big ideas and put it in a particular context. And this example is of how transformative learning was integrated in professional development for reforming policing in England. This happened a number of years ago, just happened to be in the United States right now, a very hot topic, literally. But the people who devised this curriculum were asked to help police to rethink many aspects of how they work and how they think as police. And they worked on this idea because there was a lot going on in police reform in the country at the time, of threshold concepts. So whatever field you work in, you've probably encountered this idea that there are certain kinds of ideas that you need to master and that require a total shift in your mindset in order to be able to master a discipline. I think of a fundamental and very simple example, but if you think about the fact that for many, many years, people thought the world was flat, a threshold concept is to recognize it's round. And these days, as we learn more and more about the planetary systems, a threshold concept would be to see ourselves as a little speck in a big, big universe, rather than as the center of the universe, even though our daily life is very important, located here on Earth. So these are threshold concepts, and they wanted to create a mechanism by which this could be taught. And so they started with Kolb's learning from experience cycle. I'm sure that many of you know the work of David Kolb. It is a process that looks at how we take in information and how we process it. And we move through having a concrete experience or reflecting on our actual experiences, looking at them and rethinking them through reflective observation, through being able to connect it with different interpretations from theory and from practice, and by actively experimenting with changes. And so this process itself can sometimes be transformative to people. But when they found that because they were working with the police, whenever they tried to help people go deeper into their assumptions, they ran into a great deal of resistance. And they connected over time that this had to do with professional identity. And so they created what they called a liminal cycle of reflection that enabled people to start with looking at and examining their experience, but to enter then into a space where collectively, and then on their own, and then again collectively, they considered the way in which they had interpreted it from different points of view. And so they added a critical reflection component where they had people start in the classroom and then over time write essays in the next month away from the classroom that had to do with telling their story yet again, and then telling their story yet again from the view of other people in the story, so that they had to put themselves in the other people's shoes. And then as they did that, they began to encounter feelings and views that they forgot that they had, assumptions that they held, and then they needed to capture that using an artistic medium and to retell something about their experience of the story through that medium. And the particular story that they shared in this particular paper in describing this process was of a woman police officer who worked in safety. And as she thought about a professional challenge, the first thing that came to her mind was the experience of being a young policewoman in a office where the supervisor was also a woman and who had become a bully to her. And so the brings tears to my eyes as I think of it. Leanne bullied and humiliated her. Ultimately, through this process, she came to realize that she had become a victim of identity theft. Her identity was being formed as a police person, and it was being torn away from her as she wanted to craft it and replaced with this person's heckling her and pushing her and bullying her. And she realized that her identity was stolen and she wasn't probably going to ever give it back. And so she went through this process, and she ultimately created an amazing video in which she dressed up as a clown. You see her in the picture here. She set it to a song on the clown. And she and several of her colleagues in the police force recreated some of the safety. She worked in the field of safety, some of the safety and accidents, and recreated and rethought some of the things they did in the situation and how the conflicts that arose from that would really touch on their identity. And her theme here was that the masks that police wear at work hide the people that they are. And in the story that she shared, the car crashes symbolized conflict. So I tell this long story because sometimes we think of engaging in transformative learning as a simple matter of trying out different tried and true approaches on transformative learning. And there are some, and I'm going to share what some of them are. However, we must remember that it's not only the design of the teaching and learning, but the holding space that is created by the facilitator and the peers that matter the most. You can do almost anything if you create an atmosphere of trust and you empathize and show people that you're listening to them and working through something that's difficult for them. And difficult for you too often, because it also triggers for you things that you have had in your experience. So in recreating these stories, we open up and explore blind spots from different perspectives. And I'll share with you a recent example. One of the places and ways in which we use transformative learning is a program called AEGIS, Adult Education Guided Intensive Study. And that program was designed by Dr. Mesereau according to certain principles that he felt would support transformative learning. And so we do a lot with things like identity. For example, in their first summer, I teach adult development, and I use theater of the oppressed to get people to feel the embodied concepts of what oppression is like and what it might mean and what they might have to shift to get out of oppression. But it is a cohort program, and the cohort is together in certain ways over time. And almost predictably, in the second summer, which this last summer was of the current cohort, the thin veneer of civility begins to wear off, and the irritating kinds of things that happen in a cohort begin to surface. It happened that this year they were particularly challenging because around us was happening all of the awareness of social injustice and protests of police brutality. And an incident had occurred between several of the students who were on a WhatsApp call around an incident that one of the people in our program, who is a policeman, had experienced in the protests on the street. And the reaction and response of one of the African-American women in the cohort, who just immediately was sensitive to the challenge and the difficulties that Black young men, particularly women too, but young men in particular, experience in these kinds of environments, and her fears for her son, who was about 13 years old at this time. And this was a conflict that didn't really get fully resolved. And the cohort was working it through as we worked through that summer. And so we as faculty had to join them in that. We had many challenging and difficult learning moments for ourselves as we tried to help them, support them in processing it. The individual teachers who taught courses had to rethink about how some of their teaching went so that they could make space for the triggering of this memory and the feelings that came up around it and what it is that they needed to think about in relationship to it. And this was particularly true in a course on leadership and a course on conflict management. But we also, as a cohort, had to create a space for processing these things, several spaces. And we had to find our way into doing the best we could to create a safe enough space and a brave enough space for people to process things. So this is a challenging thing. Another example, very different, many times people use journeying for supporting transformative learning. And so travel seminars, for example, become a good occasion for this. And a story in one of the transformative learning articles talks about a faculty member with two young adults who were on a tour, and they were in England. They went to look at the display of the crown jewels in the Tower of London, and in doing so, two young girls spent a lot of time looking at those crown jewels. So in the evening, when they processed this, she asked them to share what they were thinking at that time, and was totally unprepared for the completely opposite and very emotional experiences of both young women. One woman, a white woman, had a lineage in British background, and she, in fact, was very proud of these beautiful jewels and what they stood for. The other young woman, an African American, for her it recognized the exploitation of Africa, the colonization of it, and the exploitation in the mines and all of the lives of people who've been adversely affected or killed in the process of extracting and creating these beautiful jewels. And so you can see that when you open up experiences and assumptions, you sometimes get things that you aren't necessarily prepared for. And so transformative teaching and learning really does require us as educators to be ready to work through these challenging spaces. That said, there are a number of intentional transformative learning strategies that people use in teaching this. And I have listed a number of these from a particular chapter in the 2012 Transformative Learning Handbook that might be of interest to you, where it summarizes research on both the naturalistic processes that happen to support transformative learning and also intentional strategies. And these are some of the intentional strategies. I've spoken to some of them already. There's a lot of focus in these environments on self-reflection and critical reflection. Some of it is private, to get people to feel safe enough to put their thoughts in unformed ways on paper, to journal about them, to look at their own personal life histories, to look at critical incidents, but then to share those out and to create structured and critical reflection for how to deal with them. We saw this notion in the supportive social environment of an imaginal dialogue that was part of the liminal cycle of transformative learning. Arts, in this particular case, people learned digital storytelling, and they created videos in order to be able to tell the story of experiences that they had and that represented how they thought about it creatively. I have a colleague, Rita Sharon, who does a lot of work in the medical field around narrative medicine. She teaches a certificate program in that because there's so many aspects of healthcare and medicine and healing that really are suited to narrative. I personally use Theater of the Oppressed with a colleague of mine from Bermuda in my adult development class in the first semester of Aegis, because I feel that we need a way to get at the tacit and unspoken things that happen to us that are often represented in bodily language. And so we use Theater of the Oppressed to bring those to light and then to process them. And then people do use holistic and affective and spiritual processes. I often in my classes will start with a little bit of mindfulness practice with some deep breathing exercises, for example. So I think that when I thought about the question that Janet posed to me about what are some of the components of what it is we do at Teachers College, I think we do things in these three areas. I think we pay a lot of attention in our Aegis and in our regular classes to building learning communities. We have a course on communities of practice and learning communities, which we teach to Aegis and to some other cohort groups. But even in our classroom communities, we pay a lot of attention to this. We look at ways that the diversity in the group can be shared out. we create mechanisms for that that might include the arts or story sharing. There is a lot of peer learning that goes on, and we really try very hard to build a safe and really a brave space for being able to make ourselves vulnerable and bring these things out. This involves a lot of peer and learner-centered activity. Dr. Jeanette mentioned transformative listening, which she and I are working on. Empathic listening is really key to this, as well as other skills in coaching, which work on developing relationships between the facilitator and the learner, and their presence, being there for the person. And finally, there are some of these strategies in facilitation. Each one of us uses different ones. I personally do a lot of reflective work. I use questioning insight, which is also central to action learning, which is something that I do, learning from doing real work and then processing that in the moment, kind of what is done in adaptive learning in terms of case in point kind of work, and assumption exploration. But you'll note that none of this is really what Paulo Freire called the banking approach. It is not just simply giving content and skills from pre-formed ideas from our literatures and from our practices and best practices, without also attending to how people are making meaning in the first place and how the new information fits or doesn't fit with the meaning that they make of things. So I just wanted to share a few of the design principles that were particular to Aegis. Jack Mesereau created Aegis as a kind of laboratory to see what needed to be done to create a transformative learning program. It is a cohort program. People stay together for 2 years. And there's a lot of intensive work done to create this critical discourse so that people can surface and assess the validity of their assumptions. So among the things that we try to do in these programs are to help people become more aware of the context. We decontextualize or deconstruct the context, becoming more aware of the history, the norms, the cultures, the consequences of what it is that we do and what it is that other people do that we experience and feel. For example, microaggressions in the experience of race and gender. We focus on becoming, as Jack suggested, people to become more reflective and critical in their assessment of the content and process of their problem solving, putting aside or bracketing preconceived ideas so that people can openly examine evidence. We know that what happens because of the work in neuroscience is that when we encounter situations, we selectively attend to certain data and not to others. And that's because of our strong beliefs, which make it very difficult to pay attention to other things. We work on better inferences, being more open to perceptions of others, and relying less on psychological defense mechanisms. This all rests on a set of design principles that really come from learning from experience and self-directed learning. It comes from something called andragogy, which Malcolm Knowles worked on a number of years ago, which is assumptions about how it is that adults learn that look at them as more self-directing than children because of all their experience. So the purpose here is to go beyond simple awareness of what we're experiencing to how we're perceiving and why we're perceiving, thinking, judging, and feeling in certain ways. It's a process that emphasizes creating awareness of our reasons, why we experience things in that way. So things like progressively decreasing the learner's dependency on the educator, facilitating perspective taking, and reinforcing the self-concept of the learner as both the learner and doer. By providing progressive mastery. You'll notice that the example I gave earlier had to do with these threshold concepts, which are particularly important in mastery, acquiring mastery. You can't become masterful unless you pass these threshold concepts. So being able to provide for progressive mastery and a supportive climate with feedback to encourage efforts to change and to take risks. We try to avoid a certain amount of competition and judgment as we can. We are all judging machines, so putting that aside is something we have to consciously do, and use mutual support groups. I've shared with you a number of these tools. These are many of the tools that we draw on. Not all of us, each of us has our favorites, And each one does it differently depending on the pedagogy that they need to use for the content that they're teaching, as well as what they're comfortable with, what their strengths are. But they all have at their base those principles, which I have just gone through, and a number of others that Jack laid out as important to transformative learning. But story, arts, journaling, theater of the oppressed, action learning, and processing things in the moment with people so that they can become aware of what they're doing and what the consequences are of it. Collaborative inquiry, which is a form of action research, and a lot of self-assessments. For example, there are 3 courses taught on emotional intelligence, social intelligence, and cultural intelligence. And students take a lot of assessments to get a sense of how they're predisposed in some of these areas and what they can do to add new repertoires and to question some of what are the things that they are already doing. I just wanted to share 2 more slides. One is that I have adapted a set of these kinds of transformative tools, if you would, or strategies into what I call action learning conversations. These are a structured protocol which goes through these steps. It takes about 45 minutes for a group of peer learners to do, in which one person who is a challenge holder or a problem holder shares something that they're going through. For example, with a group of my peers, I might talk about how difficult I'm finding to design a particular class to teach online, because the concept just doesn't seem like something that can easily be gotten in that kind of space. And I might have 4 people who were with me, and they ask me questions about this. They help me to think differently about it. But instead of answering the questions, I just listen to their questions. I write the questions down, because by asking a question from their point of view, they're actually offering an avenue into a different line of thinking. So I value their questions. Then they talk about the assumptions that they hear me holding or that they might hold in my situation. And finally, we go into a process of my asking them, well, how would you reframe my question and my problem at this point, listening to what you've heard? And then I myself say what I'm thinking, and I make some commitment to action. So this is a very productive, simple protocol that you can put into place without much difficulty. And finally, my last slide has to do with some of these coaching competencies that support transformative learning. My colleague, Professor Malpia, has created a Columbia coaching program, which it uses a coaching process that incorporates a number of these tools very strongly and systematically. And it is predicated on concentrating on where the client wants to go, where they are. The simple edict to start where learners are. And not to impose our mindsets and skill sets on them if they're still struggling through the meaning of what they're trying to make in their own place at this moment. It's their agenda, whether or not we feel it's transformative. For them, it could be transformative. And then certain competencies, there are many of them, but these I thought were particularly important to transformative learning. The sense of presence, being with people, being curious, but suspending judgment. Emphasizing a great deal of perspective taking, finding out from different points of view how one might consider a situation, open-ended questioning and transformative listening, and testing of assumptions. There is a thing called honest labeling. So if I'm doing coaching, for example, of a student, and I use this process in my coaching, my advising process, I might be hearing certain kinds of patterns, and I might say to the student, you know, these are the things you said to me, and what I'm hearing behind it may be that you're feeling not empowered. Is that the case? And giving them a chance to say, no, I feel very empowered, it's something else. Or, oh, yes, I think maybe you may be right. What is that looking like? And then reframing points of view as one goes through a coaching process. So I hope that this has been helpful, and I'm happy to answer questions, and I will close for now, so thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point. Ok?
Obrigada, Vitória. Muito obrigada pela sua palestra maravilhosa. Né? Tenho certeza que foi uma inspiração para todos nós. E chegaram várias perguntas aqui. Eu vou fazer 2, 3 no máximo, como nós tínhamos combinado. né? Dado o volume de professores que estão acompanhando você nesse momento. Tem algumas questões que se repetiram bastante, diz respeito às áreas do conhecimento, né? Se você vê diferença, né, em da gente tratar de aprendizagem transformadoras em distintas áreas, como engenharia, saúde, etc. Né? E aí, com a sua experiência na Columbia University. E outra questão muito próxima a esta, só um minutinho que eu vou resgatando que elas estão chegando aqui. Só um segundo, por favor. É que temos uma tradição entre os professores, né, que trabalham nas suas áreas de especialização. Então, isso lhes confere muita segurança, né, ao ensinar na sua área. E a aprendizagem transformadora retira um pouco esses artefatos de segurança. Então, qual seria o desafio dos professores que buscam abordar efetivamente Transformative Learning?
Okay, so I understand the first question is, how do you see changes? How do you see that using transformative learning makes a difference? What are you looking for? Is that the question? I'm just checking, Janet. Is it how do people know that it's making a difference, or what changes do they watch for? Yes. Okay. I think it depends a bit on what your discipline and your purpose is in the class. So, for example, I teach adult learning theory in the Aegis program and in the regular program. And when I use these strategies, I know that it's making a difference when I see that my students who I ask frequently to, for example, I ask my students in classes to find an inquiry question that they themselves are struggling with in their professional practice or in their work and life as a student. And I ask them to relate the theories to their inquiry question. And so one thing I can see in this process is that the quality of their thinking shifts. One thing that they begin to be able to do, which is very important in transformative learning, is pattern recognition. So pattern recognition is something we do automatically, and it's sort of socialized into us. We don't recognize that we see things through a certain lens and see a certain pattern in it. And so I begin to get people to compare and contrast different readings, for example, that have totally different points of view, so that they can begin to themselves identify what is the pattern in the two different readings, what is at the heart of it. So part of the way that you can do it is, depending on what you're teaching, is through the shifts in the quality of their thinking, the students' abilities themselves to see assumptions that underlie readings, for example, and that begin to look at how things are different for themselves, to see that insight into themselves as they are working on an inquiry question, for example. So I think that that you can sort of set some criteria for what you expect to see in the quality of thinking. You could also measure the degree to which the learning climate becomes more open. The comfort that students have in raising difficult questions. Students frequently, the power dynamic of a professor means that students often don't raise questions that they have because they don't want to look foolish, and they can't, or they cannot formulate their question in a good enough time to be able to share it with you. So you might make those things open discussions in the class, and you might have at the end of the class Stephen Brookfield, who does a lot of this work, has a set of several questions that he asks students to write down, things that have to do with what was the most surprising thing you learned? What was the most perplexing thing you learned? What are your questions? He'll ask several questions at the end, and he will collect those and read them, and he will make adjustments to his teaching. And in fact, in the online environment, he frequently does that by using back channel which is a anonymous channel where people can talk about what they're thinking as they're going through it. So I think depending on your discipline, you would have to make some judgments about what it is that ought to change. In fact, we are just about to embark on a project with some educators in the engineering field in Iraq through seminars and through work with them. And they had gone to the University of Oklahoma and learned about transformative learning. And now they want to learn a little bit more deeply how to use it in their curriculum. So I may be able to answer that question with respect to engineering more in about 6 months, if you want to ask it again. In terms of the traditions that teachers have and the security they feel, I think this is a very important question because above all, we as teachers, as educators, we need to feel competent in what it is that we do. I think that's a good thing, but it can also be what Professor Chris Argyris of a business school who talked about action science, and he talked about the big assumptions that really often cause us to do things that are actually the opposite, get the opposite effect to what we want. And he said that, because of competence, when you run into a situation where your competence is being questioned, you can get shattered. You can feel, he talks about the roller coaster, you go from the heights to the depths. So I think that part of what needs to be done here is to realize that actually students like to know that there are some things that you're both entering into that you haven't done before and that you're trying out. So you can be a role model to students. I tell students, I haven't done this activity before with people like you. I've tried it out, but for example, transformative listening, which Jeanette and I are working on. We've used transformative listening in a number of situations, but I used it in my adult development class in order to process feelings after doing theater of oppressed. And I said to students, this is a tricky situation. I don't know exactly how this is going to do. So I'm entering into some new territory with you. And we make, we help our students know that we too can learn and need to learn different kinds of things. So I think you will feel some discomfort if you depart from routines that you think are working. However, one thing to do is to first test whether the routines that you're using are really achieving the results that you hope. And the example that I'm giving here comes from Padua University in Italy. I do some work with various universities in Italy, and one of my colleagues at Padua University, they were going through transforming the curriculum, and they sent a survey out to all their students throughout the entire university, and they were shocked by the results because the students were not happy with all of those tried and true routines that we use in our teaching, and they felt that there were many things missing from the educational process. So I think we should also try to collect some information to see if the routines are working and if they're achieving the results that we want. Don't tamper with those routines. You don't have to change everything. Think about where and how transformative learning might be useful to advance the goals, the educational goals that you have for yourself and for your students. Find something. There's a lot of literature out there about the things that you can use. There are many good examples that looks like it fits with what you're teaching in engineering, in math, literature, whatever it might be, leadership, sustainability, and try something out. Invite the students in, create projects for the students in which they try to do something that's different, that aligns with something that you feel is missing from your curriculum. So I think it's better to make it easier and to step into doing things that you're not as comfortable with in small ways and experiment with them just as you would hope your students do, and let them know that this is an experiment.
Obrigada, Vitória. Tem outras questões aqui aparecendo, e uma delas acho bem importante endereçar, que é da professora Maria Lúcia Vasconcelos. Ela pergunta o seguinte: São muitas as aproximações da aprendizagem transformadora, né, com o trabalho de Paulo Freire. Educação crítica, dialogada, educação que abrigue a realidade. E ela pergunta como você vê, né, que nós podemos dar um aspecto nosso, né, brasileiro, ao que você está apresentando.
In other words, you're asking how does Mesro alike or different from Freire, I think. I think that's what you're asking. I'm not advocating that you adopt Mesro. I think that there are many approaches, as I said in the opening, to transformative learning. And Paulo Freire's approach, if it's working for you and for your students, is one of the best ones that's out there. So I would say if you're doing Paulo Freire, if you're using his work and it's working and you're satisfied with it, there's no need for you to move into the area of Jack Mesro's approach to transformative learning. It's a little difference in terms of what is aligned with your teaching, your educational pedagogy, your discipline. In some disciplines, more work has been done using Mesro because it seems to align with that. But it doesn't align with some areas in the psychological space where, for example, there's more emphasis on the kind of work that John Dirks does, which is very different from Paulo Freire's also. So I think you must choose the transformative learning approach that is best for you and for your students. I don't think anybody wants you to adopt something just for the sake of adopting it.
Sem dúvida nenhuma. E, por fim, uma última pergunta. O ensino superior, ele passa por muitas críticas, né? E, às vezes, até a descrença da sua importância, da sua relevância, né? Que entra em dúvida. Como que a gente pode, né, a aprendizagem transformadora, ajudar a dar sentido ao ensino superior novamente? Para os jovens, né?
Well, I think this is a question all of us are wrestling with. You're right that higher education is, I think, going through a critical disjuncture. I think actually in the long run, we need a course correction in higher education because we are predicated on certain models, not that we have to throw them out completely, but we were created to preserve and protect knowledge. And these days, in the world that we're living in with the exponential shifts in knowledge creation and technology, with the growth of artificial intelligence, with globalization, with so many things, with all of the changes that we have around climate, immigration, we have to rethink a number of these things. So I think that we can be most credible by using whatever we have, whether it's what you're already doing or whether it's transformative in some way, to create relevance for society. And so one of the things that becomes problematic is that we as faculty are rewarded when we only publish very, very good research in top tier journals. Very, very good research in top tier journals takes years to produce and years to get published. By that time, the young people are on to some new challenge for which this is no longer relevant. So I think we have to question in our disciplines, in our professional associations, in higher education. We don't have to throw everything out that we've been doing, but we also have to understand how do we create agile, flexible, experimental centers that are able to help those people who are aligned with fields where this is required to do this in a good way. And I point, for example, to my colleague at Thomas Jefferson University, who is, he's become a Macy Fellow. In the field of medicine, that's a very big honor. He's been at Harvard, has the Macy Fellows program, and he's just been one of several Macy Fellows to work on this project of an ambiguity curriculum in for medical doctors preparation, because the field of knowledge in medicine is just exponentially shifting in so many ways. And doctors are always faced with these questions of, judgments and decisions about what's wrong with people are not conclusive. They need to have an ambiguity mindset. And so we need to encourage this experimentation. We need to have laboratories and places where we can do these things that show relevance to our constituents, to the organizations that hire our students and things of that sort. So that's my sense of where we might be able to do that. Thank you, that was a great question. Not that all of the questions are not great.
Eu que agradeço, Vitória. Nós já ocupamos muito do seu tempo aqui. A sua fala foi absolutamente inspiradora e nos convida a uma reflexão e a uma ação, né, nessa nossa jornada em direção à aprendizagem transformadora. É claro que a gente já faz muita coisa nesse sentido, mas como você disse, né, o ensino superior a gente tem que estar sempre nos renovando e temos que nos transformar conforme o próprio mundo muda à nossa volta. Então eu quero agradecer demais por toda essa parceria da Columbia University, da Teachers College, especificamente conosco, né? E vou, de toda forma, endereçar depois as outras questões para você por e-mail. Eu quero agradecer a todos que estiveram aqui conosco. Muito obrigada. Eu quero agradecer a todos os professores que estiveram conosco aqui nesta manhã, as autoridades presentes, né, que ouviram, né, esta palestra da professora Vitória Marsic, e quero encerrar lembrando os professores que amanhã as nossas conversas sobre aprendizagem transformadora continuam, né? Nós vamos ter aqui a participação do professor Jeff King, da Universidade de Oklahoma, Peter Taylor, da Murdoch University na Austrália, Naline Shitand, da África do Sul, Paul Dervan e Sandra Thompson, da Irlanda, que também vem compartilhar conosco as suas experiências do que está sendo feito ao redor do mundo, já que essa é uma preocupação de todos nós, né, que o ensino superior avance. Então, mais uma vez, obrigada a todos e nos encontramos em breve nas nossas reuniões, né, mensais, Marcic, para dar sequência ao nosso trabalho. Obrigada, professores, obrigada, meus colegas, e tenham um ótimo resto de dia, né, a partir dessa inspiração da professora Marcic. Um grande abraço a todos e obrigada pelas múltiplas perguntas que vocês enviaram. Um forte abraço.